Okay, so for this section of skeletal muscle, we're just going to focus on sort of the macro structure of skeletal muscle, some differences between skeletal muscle and other types of muscle, and then the lectures after that we'll get into more what's going on in the muscle cell, what's causing muscle contraction, and in different structures involved in that. So to start off with, as we talk about skeletal muscle, understand that the main function of skeletal muscle that we consider is locomotion, movement. And that makes sense. When you think of muscles, what muscles do is they move. They move your bones, they move your head, they move whatever it is that you want to move. And the 650 some odd muscles that are in your body generally have that role in some kind of movement. In fact, more specifically, moving bones in some direction. Having said that, though, that's actually not the only purpose for skeletal muscle. We also see the skeletal muscle plays a big role in posture. You actually have muscles around your abdominal cavity, your lower back, upper part of your legs, your calves as well, your soleus muscles, which when we're moving are continually keeping us balanced and upright. And even though skeletal muscle contraction is typically voluntary, we may not always think of those motions as voluntary. Staying balanced isn't always a voluntary thing. We're responding to gravity, but it really is a voluntary action. And so posture, balance, skeletal muscle is going to play a big role in. Also, kind of in another direction, producing heat. Now, you've probably, if you've ever been somewhere where it's cold and there's like white stuff that falls from the sky called snow, you'll know that we, in response to cold, shiver. Now that shiver, that muscle contraction, is intended to produce heat. Now in humans, it doesn't do a great job. If you want to get warm, go inside, go near a fire, wear gloves, wear a hat. Shivering's not great, but it is another function of skeletal muscle to use energy, and then is part of that reaction to produce heat. Now, as we talk about skeletal muscles in this chapter, I'm not going to have you memorize all the names of the 650 of them. There'll be other classes like kinesiology where you'll learn insertions of muscles and origins, you'll learn muscle groups, and a lot of those muscles you will learn in really, really detailed. For this class, we're really going to be more focused on function. How do muscle cells contract? What's involved? What are some of the steps involved in contraction? What are the things that are going to affect their function? So we're going to be a little more interested in the function of that. But having said that, because of some of the terms you've learned already, for example, some of the anatomical terms, the abdominal area, brachial area, dorsal, those areas, you actually already know the names of some muscles. Not surprisingly, in the brachial area of the body, which is your upper arm, the muscles there are often called brachii, your bicep brachii, your tricep brachii. Not surprising, in your abdominal region, over your abdominal cavity, you have the rectus abdominis muscles. You also have transverse abdominis muscles, named after their anatomical location. You often also have muscles named after an anatomical position. For example, you may have medial and lateral muscles. The vastus medialis, the vastus lateralis. Those are muscles in your upper leg. They're named after anatomical locations. Some muscles will be superior, inferior. Some muscles will be named not after anatomical location, but after their function. You have flexors and extenders, abductors and adductors. This is a type of movement that those muscles do. And so, although memorizing these muscles is it's a lot of memorization you won't have to do for this class, you already know actually a lot of these, where they are, what they do already. Now, as we look at skeletal muscle, I do want to at least make a mention that there are two other types of muscle that do exist. And we're going to hit on these, particularly cardiac muscle, later on in the semester. But as we look at skeletal muscle, we often say that skeletal muscle is voluntary. In other words, it's under voluntary control. If you want to move your finger, you can move your finger. But there are other types of muscle, one being smooth muscle cells. Now, smooth muscle cells typically are lining organs. They line your small and large intestine. And the contraction created by these muscles we often call involuntary. In other words, we typically don't tell our large intestine to contract, and it does that. That's not under our voluntary control. Smooth muscle also is generally not striated. Skeletal muscle has striations to it. We'll talk more about that in the next video. It's caused by microfilaments, actin and myosin, in the way they line up here in the muscle. Smooth muscle has a little bit different architecture to it, so it's not striated. And it also only has one nuclei. That's unique because skeletal muscle has multi-nucleus. We often say it's multinucleated, has more than one nucleus. Now, the last type is cardiac muscle. I'm actually going to skip cardiac muscle for a few weeks because we're going to talk for weeks about the heart and the cardiovascular system and blood vessels and blood and all of that. So you'll know a lot about the heart by the time we're done. But let's just keep it simple today and just say, hey, you also have cardiac muscle. That's muscle around your heart. It's in your heart. It's involuntary. In other words, you don't tell your heart muscle to contract. And these cells are striated and they have one single nucleus. That's all we're going to hit today as far as cardiac goes. We'll go more to that later on in the semester. Okay, so let's now get to a little bit more as far as actual muscle structure and function. Now, a good way to picture this, and this helped me a little bit in understanding overall kind of macro structure of muscle, is a piece of chicken. So if you've ever gone to KFC or gotten chicken breasts from somewhere, if you've ever eaten that, not with your fingers or not with your fork and knife, but with your fingers, you may notice that as you kind of pull off sections of the chicken breast, it actually comes off in sort of strands. Well, those strands technically are what we call fascicles. Chickens have those, so do we. Not that we human, that's a little weird, but we have the same fascicle structure in skeletal muscle in humans as well. And all fascicles are bundles of muscle cells, muscle fibers. Now, a little side note here before we move on. When I use the word muscle cell and muscle fiber, those are the same thing. I will try to use the word muscle cell a little bit more in this class because we're going to talk about how muscle cells contract and how muscle cells function. However, in more common vernacular, when we talk about physiology of exercise, muscle contraction, we often use the word muscle fiber. Same thing. Muscle fiber, muscle cell, they're the same term. So fascicles are made up of bundles of muscle cells, muscle fibers, that make up an entire muscle. These have connective tissue around them. There's endomysium, paramysium, epimysium. We'll talk about these in a second. And then our muscles have tendons that attach to bone. And probably the best example of this is in this next slide. And I'm going to use this as sort of a picture of how this looks. So this actually is your bicep brachii muscle. It's located in your upper arm near your humerus bone. And you'll notice that around the entire muscle is epimysium. That's a connective tissue around the entire muscle. Now, that muscle is made up of fascicles. Again, just like we talked about with chicken. That fascicle is surrounded by paramysium. Paramysium, that's, again, connective tissue. And inside those fascicles are going to be muscle cells, muscle fibers. Those are surrounded by endomysium, again, connective tissue. So we're going from sort of this larger macro structure to this smaller microstructure. And as we get towards the distal end of this muscle, we're going to get to a tendon or an aponeurosis, and that will insert onto a bone. Now, this is what's going to cause the bone to move. In kinesiology, you're going to talk a ton about insertions and origins and where the muscles insert and originate. For right now, I just want you to know that at the end of these muscles are tendons that's going to attach to a bone or multiple bones to cause them to move in some direction. Pretty simple. And we can see a microscopic view here. A little hard to see, but we can see that in here we have some muscle cell, muscle fibers. We have some endomysium around those. We can see some paramysium around a fascicle. There looks like there's a fascicle here. Looks like there might be another fascicle there. Again, it's sort of a microscopic level of this architecture. Now, last but certainly not least, and I want to kind of leave this lecture with this kind of term, because when we look at muscle, it's hard to just look at muscle itself because muscle cells don't just contract on their own. A message has to be sent to them. from the brain, from the central nervous system. And so it's not just like you have this thought and then boom, there's contraction. There needs to be a message, a signal sent. Well, that signal occurs through the nervous system. We're going to talk a ton about the nervous system in coming lectures, in coming weeks. But for today, I just want to hit a real basic of how these two intertwine. And a term we often use is what's called a motor unit. And all a motor unit is simply a single neuron and all the muscle fibers it stimulates, or another word we use is innervate. So, good way to think about this. You have a neuron, or nerve cell, that will travel from the central nervous system, your brain or spinal cord, all the way down to some number of muscle cells. Now, understand, in a muscle, say your bicep brachii, you could have tens of millions of muscle cells. You're not going to have tens of millions of neurons. So typically for one neuron, it will innervate multiple muscle cells. Truth be told, tens of thousands of muscle cells. Sometimes that's a small number. Sometimes that's a large number. Hence we have small motor units, larger motor units. These actually do have a function. If you have a smaller motor unit, that's really good for very fine movement. So not surprisingly, around our fingers, things like that kind of movement. Where around our eyes, face, we tend to have smaller motor units. When it comes to larger muscles like our quadricep muscles, we tend to have much larger motor units. The movements there aren't as exact. It's hard to write with your leg, but you can produce a ton of power with your leg. So there's a function and an advantage to having both large and small motor units. We'll get into those a little bit more as we talk about muscle cell function, because it's at this point that we're going to move from kind of neurons and nerves down to the muscle cell, down to what's going on when a neuron hits a muscle cell, what causes it to contract, and what's going on in the muscle cell to do that. We will cover that in the next video.